and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Sonia Hilgren. I am president of the National Press Club and editor of Farm Journal. I'd like to welcome club members in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN and listening on National Public Radio and the Global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind members of some upcoming speakers. On Thursday, April 25th, Henry Cisneros, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, will present the first annual State of America's Communities. On Wednesday, May 8th, the Governor of Hong Kong, Christopher Patten, will address a press club audience. And on Thursday, May 9th, Beverly Sills, former opera singer and current chairman of the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, will talk about the future of the arts in a downsized world. I'd also like to mention to our members here today that we have a book and author rap session coming up with former Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire this Thursday, April 25th at 6:30 p.m. His book is entitled Combat: 12 Years in the U.S. Senate. Transcripts and audio and video tapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-NPC-2334. If you have questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your tables and send them up to me. I will ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. From your right, John Sawyer, Washington Bureau Chief, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Lisa Zagaroli, Detroit News. Muriel Riccio, Fort Worth Star-Tribune. Star-Telegram. There's a mistake here, but I knew the right answer. Harding Carter. The third, President, Main Street Productions. Stephen Labaton, New York Times. Pamela Gilbert, wife of the Speaker. Peggy Roberson, freelance journalist and chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Cassandra Lewis, daughter of the Speaker. Greg Gordon, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and member of the Press Club Speakers Committee, who arranged today's luncheon. Susan Garland, Business Week. And Tom Deemer of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Our guest today has been compared to a Boy Scout because of his innocent appearance and bottomless enthusiasm. Some people say he looks and acts a bit like a mild-mannered Clark Kent. But don't be fooled by Chuck Lewis's disarming style. Since he formed the Center for Public Integrity, in an office that he compares to a post office box, the group's bite has left more than a few national figures in tatters. It was Lewis who called a news conference a few months ago to denounce GOP candidate Pat Buchanan for letting Larry Pratt, the head of the Gun Owners of America, serve as a national campaign co-chairman. Lewis pointed out that Pratt had been present at a meeting attended by leaders of the white supremacist Aryan Nation, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Christian Identity Movement. Within hours of the news conference, Pratt announced he was taking a leave of absence from the Buchanan campaign. Lewis is a significant force in the nation's capital, a new government watchdog alongside the likes of Ralph Nader and Joan Claybrook. If the mainstream press is not doing enough hard-hitting, investigative reporting on ethics in government, Lewis's center is there to fill the void. A graduate of the University of Delaware and the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Lewis worked for 11 years as an investigative reporter for ABC and CBS News. Frustrated with the time and space constraints of TV, he quit his last TV job as producer for 60 Minutes in 1988. The next day, he decided to try to create a more perfect form of journalism. His first report traced a long trail of White House trade officials who had gone to work for foreign companies and governments. It led to a General Accounting Office investigation. Lewis's group won funding from nonprofit foundations. In the 1992 presidential race, candidate Bill Clinton, Jerry Brown, Pat Buchanan, and Ross Perot all cited the center's findings. The center, now equipped with a paid staff of 6 and legions of volunteers, has churned out 18 reports since then, developing a reputation for being tough but fair. Lewis insists that everyone named in the center's report be offered a chance to respond, a high standard not always adhered to by the news media pressed by minute-to-minute deadlines. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the National Press Club, a conscience for the news media and politicians alike, Charles Lewis.
Thank you. What an introduction there. I want to thank the Press Club for inviting me here today. I'd also like to thank some other people who are here. My extraordinarily supportive wife, Pamela, and my daughter, Cassie, who are up here today. The magnificent Center for Public Integrity staff, who I think are among the hardest working, most talented professionals in this city. And 2 members of the Center Advisory Board, Pearl Stewart, former Oakland Tribune editor, now a Freedom Forum journalist in residence at Xavier University, in from New Orleans, and Hodding Carter, former newspaper editor, former State Department spokesman, currently professor of journalism at the University of Maryland, among many other titles. Hodding has been on the advisory board since it began, and frequently after we have issued an investigative study, he has received angry phone calls or letters from the famous and the powerful, complaining about what we have written or the questions we have asked. To Hodding's credit, he has steadfastly stood by the Center for Public Integrity and its work over the years, and I thank him for that. As everyone at the Center knows, I love quotes, and one of my favorites is by Harry Truman, who said, "I don't give people hell, I just tell the truth, and they think it's hell." No one has ever accused us of desperately seeking salmon in this town. We've never been interested in being invited to dinner at the homes of important government officials, which is really good because we're practically never invited. 6 years ago today, the Center for Public Integrity was just a P.O. box and an idea. Sending 300 or 400 letters a month from my house in Virginia with just $2,000 in the Center bank account and giving new meaning to the phrase white knuckles, I signed a $60,000 2-year lease for the first office of the Center in downtown Washington, which we opened in May of 1990. At first, there was no furniture except for a car I brought from home. Our first paid intern from the University of Southern California had to work for a few days while sitting on a windowsill. Today, the Center is in its second office, more than twice the size of the first one, just 2 blocks from the White House. We now have had more than 100 paid interns. The Center has conducted 20 investigative projects, including 19 published studies, most recently a commercially published book, now in its 3rd printing, The Buying of the President. In late 1994, we hired the former director of news for NBC, Alex Bennis, and a couple months ago, we hired the managing editor of the National Journal, Bill Hogan. We never called a news conference to announce our formal existence as an organization. We just started investigative center studies at news conferences held here at the Press Club. Our annual budget is under $1 million, and we have always disinformation about our sources and funding. Described as an investigative think tank by the Boston Globe and the IRE Journal, the Nonpartisan Center for Public Integrity does heavy lifting research about public service and ethics-related issues. From day one, we have been fascinated by the mercenary culture of politics, which places private gain ahead of the broad public interest and public trust, a mercenary culture in which vital decisions at all levels, local, state, and federal, are too frequently corroded by distortions of the public debate. I've always enjoyed these newsmaker luncheons, particularly the one a few weeks ago which awarded 2 women journalists, one in Seattle, Washington, one formerly in Turkey, who displayed guts and courage in writing the truth and offending the powers that be. Kathy George of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and Eliza Marcus of Reuters were given the National Press Club's annual Freedom of the Press Award. We all know that reporters, not only in Turkey but throughout the former Soviet Union, not to mention Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and elsewhere, are murdered each year for seeking to find and to tell the truth. I sometimes think that in this country, too often we take our freedoms and constitutional rights to question authority for granted. And as much as we sometimes complain about the lack of disclosure of public information, the fact is that here in the United States, the people have more access to information than any country in the world. In 1992, I was invited to speak at an international conference on investigative reporting in Moscow. I was struck by the stark differences in perspectives. A British journalist had been jailed 5 times for violating national secrecy laws. An editor in New Delhi had also been jailed for unveiling national secrets. A reporter in South Africa had seen her sources murdered in the streets. One reporter who spoke, Maria Jimena Duzan, had written about the Medellin cartel in her Bogota, Colombia newspaper. Afterwards, her apartment was blown up and her sister was murdered. Meanwhile, most of us from the United States found ourselves complaining about the difficulties with the Freedom of Information Act and other non-life-threatening issues. Just because we have the Freedom of the Press and the Freedom of Information Act and other freedoms, however, doesn't mean those rights and privileges are fully exercised or utilized. Far less is disclosed than should be in this country, frequently because powerful folks don't want it disclosed. Recently, the Tampa Tribune did an impressive series of stories on the massive conflicts of interest in the Florida legislature. In one particular committee on health care, there was a bill to require hospitals to publicly disclose to consumers statistical information about the fatal and not-fatal accidents and mistakes made by doctors and nurses in their facilities. The bill died in committee, and the votes to kill this sunshine measure were cast by doctors or hospital officials serving on this committee of the Florida part-time citizen legislature. Not only is sunshine the best disinfectant in a democracy, I truly believe that information is power. At the Center for Public Integrity, what we do and what we believe, we could have just as easily named our organization the Center for Public Information. In late January, the Washington Post, in conjunction with the Kaiser Family Foundation and Harvard University, published an excellent 6-part series called Reality: The Politics of Mistrust. After extensive public opinion polling, it was affirmed that people who know about politics vote more often than people who do not. In other words, knowledge acts as a bridge to participation. Information also, of course, can provoke anger and change. The Center for Public Integrity was the first organization to discover that after they left government, half the White House trade officials went to work for the people they had been negotiating against, foreign governments and foreign corporations. Today, such revolving door activity is illegal. I won't go through all 20 investigative projects and the impact some of the information made. But for example, the Center for Public Integrity was among the first organizations to ask presidential candidate Steve Forbes for his tax returns. When he refused to release them, with the help of the FEC disclosure material and a certified public accountant, estimated that with the flat tax he was proposing, Forbes' annual tax liability would be cut in half. Forbes never disclosed those tax returns, but in polls, 60% of the public believed that they ought to be public information. Dole and Graham issued their tax returns, and the flat tax issue faded a bit along with Forbes' candidacy. The buying of the President is the first systematic examination of the financial relationships and entanglements of America's major 1996 presidential candidates, and it has the added advantage of being published before the election. What a concept. When we vote for a candidate, we are getting a package deal, the politician and his or her career patrons. Isn't it about time the public was told about these special interests behind each of the candidates? We are excited that this book, published by is in its 3rd printing, and the New York Times recently purchased the overseas serialization rights. We never said that money is the only significant factor in presidential or other elections, but it is clearly an essential ingredient. Indeed, without it, candidacies die on the vine. In every presidential election since 1976, the candidate who has raised the most money at the end of the year preceding the election and played by the post-Watergate rules and been eligible for matching funds, the candidate who has raised the most money has become his party's nominee without exception. In 1995, Bill Clinton and Bob Dole each raised the most money, roughly $25 each, and both today are their party's presumptive nominees. In 1995, $110 million in private money was raised by the major presidential candidates, more than any preceding presidential election in U.S. history. Preceding year in U.S. history. 3 presidential candidates, Pat Buchanan, Bob Dole, and Lamar Alexander, each began laying the groundwork for their presidential bids in 1993 or earlier by raising millions of dollars secretly through their nonprofit foundations. Dole and Alexander were essentially shamed into releasing the names of the donors in 1995, and it was discovered that several contributions exceeded $100,000. Buchanan still refuses to release the names of his foundation donors, although it has been reported that textile magnate Roger Milliken contributed roughly $2 million. Speaking of stonewalling requests for what ought to be public information, the Clinton People's Inaugural, which raised more money for an inauguration than anyone in history, $42 million, still refuses to release the names of that foundation's $100,000 donors. Why? As an investigative reporter for almost 20 years, it always worries me when people who do public things don't want to talk about them. Now at the Center for Public Integrity, we understand that occasionally people in this town might not want to talk to us. We don't take it personally. But that doesn't mean the questions should fade away, unanswered and ignored. That's one of the reasons we keep asking them. We hope journalists and the general public share our curiosity and raise the issue themselves. The Center for Public Integrity has, we've been informed, one of the most popular websites on the internet, which includes financial disclosure information about all the major presidential candidates and what we call unanswered questions. They were asked in early January, and they're still unanswered. How does Bob Dole explain his relationship with a California-based Gala wine family? He has helped them receive millions of dollars in tax, export subsidy, and other favors, and the Galas are Dole's top career patron, contributing $381,000 over the years, not counting $700,000 to the Dole Foundation. I don't think there are all that many grapes in Kansas. How does President Clinton explain his close relationship with his top patron, the New York investment bank Goldman Sachs? Former Goldman Sachs Chairman Rudman and his wife gave $300,000 to the Democratic Party to help ensure Clinton's election in 1992. Rubin is currently serving in his second cabinet post and personally handled the $20 billion Mexican bailout following the Mexico peso devaluation crisis, a policy strongly sought by Goldman Sachs. Whether the bailout was wise or unwise is not the point. The public ought to know the close relationship exists between the president and the patron. Does anyone besides me find troubling that 4 1996 presidential candidates, Clinton, Dole, Alexander, and Graham, have been involved in beneficial real estate deals with their campaign contributors? Why is it the candidates are never asked about these issues? Now people are beginning to think about the political party conventions in San Diego and Chicago. Each political party will get a check from the U.S. Treasury for $12 million to put on their conventions. Now, $12 million seems like enough money to put on a party. That's a lot of balloons. But in 1992, federal taxpayer funds paid for only about half of the Republican convention, and taxpayer money covered less than 1/3 of the $38 million spent by Democrats at Madison Square Garden. Special interests will dump millions of dollars into these parties and their city host committees, and you will see remarkable hospitality suite corporate schmoozing this summer. Who is giving the money, and does each presumptive party nominee, Bob Dole and Bill Clinton, in the name of sunshine and frequently mentioned reform, do they pledge that all of such corporate receptions will be open to the public? We are thrilled by the acclaim the buying of the President has received. It hasn't, of course, been unanimous. There are the usual non-denial denials from the parties and their candidates. But one columnist actually wrote that we exaggerated the influence of money, and in so doing were deceitful and dangerously wrong to feed that cynicism. Not only was nothing exaggerated, the people who play the game of politics bear most of the responsibility for any cynicism which resides in the public today. After Vietnam and Watergate, after the resignation of the House Speaker and Majority Whip, after the Keating Five and other SNL-related scandals, the HUD scandal, the defense procurement fraud, the House check kiting scandal, the conviction of the House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Dan Rostenkowski, the 4 independent counsel investigations of the Clinton administration, the resignation of the Senate Finance Committee Chairman Bob Packwood, and other scandals too numerous to mention, how could Americans not be wary of and distrustful of their politicians? Indeed, I think frankly that it is dangerous and deceitful for political reporters to pretend that money has no influence upon the political process, to hardly ever write about the relationships between politicians and their patrons, to protect the political practitioners and their sponsors from any uncomfortable questions which might pierce the veneer of evasion which straight, mindless horse race reporting provides. And finally, since when was it the role of a journalist, or anyone, to personally decide what is dangerous for this democracy? What happened to good old-fashioned reporting of the facts, all the facts? It is to say, and as many have, news media do indeed bear some responsibility for the cynicism in America. Last week, the Los Angeles Times published an interesting, thoughtful series of front-page stories entitled "Beyond Skepticism: Have the Media Crossed the Line into Cynicism?" That and other analyses I have read do not blame investigative journalism for providing substantive information about the backgrounds of the candidates. Quite the contrary, it is exactly the horse race reportage that is the culprit, contributing to cynicism. For example, according to the Center for Media and Public Affairs, in the first 3 months of 1996, there were 2.5 times as many evening network news stories on who's ahead than on the substance of the candidates' policies. Reporters were on the air 6 times longer talking to each other than the presidential candidates they were covering. 13 hours of network television evening news time versus 2 hours. Voters are turned off by strategy stories, public opinion polls which sometimes seem to suggest the race is all but over. Control, attack ads, and other efforts by candidates to manipulate public perceptions. On the other hand, and this is not scientific, just my own 2 cents, I believe the public yearns for information which affects their daily lives, which is directly relevant to their economic situation. When people read about well-heeled interests influencing public policies, it gets their attention and it gets their blood pumping. How else do you explain that wonderful America What Went Wrong series by America's premier investigative journalists Don Bartlett and Jim Steele of the Philadelphia Inquirer? After the first day's story, the Inquirer's daily circulation jumped 10,000. Ultimately, there were more than 225,000 requests for reprints of the series, and the book, published later, was a bestseller. People want this information, and they seldom get it. In Indiana, there had been almost no in-depth reporting about the money behind the state legislature, in large part because the campaign finance records, as in many states, are still on paper. The Center for Public Integrity took 19,000 records, entered them into a relational computer database, and gave the suddenly accessible information to a dozen news organizations. The Indianapolis Star did a series of stories entitled State House Sellout, How Special Interests Hijacked the Legislature. More than 2,000 readers contacted the newspaper, the biggest response in the newspaper's history. The Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette and Evansville Courier also did series of stories, as did WTHR-TV, the NBC affiliate in Indianapolis. Within weeks, the legislature voted to computerize the records, and after it was discovered that the Indiana House Ways and Means Committee chairman had been receiving $40,000 in gambling industry money under the table, the legislature voted to ban all gambling contributions. Information was provided, and the people responded. Since I quoted a Democrat earlier, in that bipartisan, nonpartisan, apolitical, whatever spirit, I will close with a quote from a Republican, Abraham Lincoln. I'm a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts. Thank you.
Well, since you ended with Abraham Lincoln, I will begin with him. In your book, you note that Abraham Lincoln was a railroad lawyer who ran a $100,000 campaign in 1860, spending twice as much as Stephen Douglas to win the presidency. Lincoln then oversaw nationwide development of American rails. What has changed since then? And do you think past presidents, even the great ones, could have withstood the scrutiny of your center?
It's a great question. I think the great ones could withstand the scrutiny of the center. I think that we sometimes don't have great ones anymore. We have a lot of people this year who chose not to enter politics. Colin Powell said, fix the process. Jack Kemp, who was the front runner, chose not to run because he already owed $100,000 from the last election in '88. And the prospect of going to 250 fundraisers in 1995 and 80% travel on the road was totally repugnant to him. He said, I'm not a compulsive individual. I'm 60 years old. I have grandchildren. I believe in ideas, and I'm not going to go around with a tin cup. I refuse. You have Dick Cheney, Bill Bennett, Dan Quayle, and many others who also chose not to enter the fray. I say that today you have millionaires or people who are willing and able to raise millions of dollars from people that most of us would never want to spend any time with, and that's who runs and enters the process. And so I do think we have a process that's out of control, a money chase that's out of control. When you have to raise $123,000 a day, as Bill Clinton did in 1995, we're not talking bake sales here. There are people giving money, and they've got ideas about what they want back. And if you read The Buying the President, you'll see that they're frequently not disappointed. Regarding Abraham Lincoln, always one of my heroes and still one of my heroes. The reason I put Lincoln and FDR, there's also a vignette about FDR in the book along these lines. Politicians in the United States have always had entanglements with special interests that help them achieve power. And I wanted people to think we weren't just Boy Scouts, or that we hadn't just fallen off the turnip truck. And so we mentioned those vignettes. Yes, special interests have had influence over the years. There is no way to measure this, because records were, if you think they're bad today, you should have seen them 100 years ago. So there's no way to measure, and it's a totally subjective comment on my part, but I really strongly think that the money has gotten so out of control that you have to run 3 and 4 years in advance to be a serious candidate, that good people aren't entering. I do think that it's different today than it was then, and I think the likes of an Abe Lincoln or Harry Truman and some of those folks would probably not go through it today. I think there's a fair case to be made that they would scratch their heads a little bit. And so that's the answer to that.
If individual campaign contributions could be raised beyond $1,000 and $5,000 limits, politicians wouldn't have to spend as much money, as much time raising money, and depend as much on the parties. Isn't the campaign finance law messed up when these limits are different between candidates and the parties, and when Steve Forbes can run without any limits on what he spends?
Well, as many of you know, the Supreme Court in 1976 ruled in Buckley versus Vallejo that a candidate, whether he's a millionaire or he's not a millionaire, can spend as much as he wants on his own campaign. Until that Supreme Court case is overturned, you will not have, you will still have millionaires spending a lot of money. You'll still have Huffington spending $28 million in California. You'll still have people like Steve Forbes entering the race. There are people in the Congress right now, some of whom are retiring, like Bill Bradley, who think you need to do a constitutional amendment, literally, to the Constitution on that whole free speech issue. On the question of limits, I have to say, I confess, I really think that the folks that are pushing that, I really worry if they don't have a bad case of political amnesia. Let's go back to 1974 just for a moment. Most Americans did not like learning about smoky bars and offshore accounts and suitcases of cash. The average contribution to Richard Nixon and CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, being $40,000. $2 million check from Clement Stone. Most Americans felt that this was out of control and that money should not buy elections, and it should be disclosed, it should be accounted for, and yes, there should be limits of some sort to diminish the power of money in some way. And actually, believe it or not, the Supreme Court did uphold that money can influence elections in their famous decision in '76. So now you have folks who say, get rid of the limits, they're hopeless, no one can enforce them. That's a whole other story. Why can't you enforce them? Maybe it's because you created an agency that is weak and inefficient and can't enforce them. That's a whole other issue. But the bottom line is, to me, it's counterintuitive. If you have a raging fire, the way to control that fire is to put water, not kerosene, on it. I am not convinced that if you raise the limits, that the amounts next time, it won't be $110 million in 1999. It'll be $200 million, because now they have a $5,000 limit. And that's what you're asking for, and I just don't get it. I honestly, I think I took logic, but I forgot, I just missed something there.
So if wealthy people and PACs don't pay for campaigns, who does? Isn't total public financing as destructive to democracy as our current system?
Exactly who pays for campaigns and how they are paid is something that this republic must resolve. There are 40 proposals right now in the House and Senate offering solutions from subsidized advertising to constitutional amendments to raising limits, lowering limits. There are states, 27 or 29 states have adopted initiatives to change the way their races are financed, and there are experts in this room who know all about that. I think the issue here is, are the American people fed up enough to do something drastic? If you look at public opinion polls in the last 5-6 years, 70 or 80% of the American people want to clean up politics. They want political reform. But you have unfocused anger. The anger, there has been no leadership in this country by the Speaker of the House or the President. They shake hands in New Hampshire and nothing happens. No one really wants to deal with this issue for all kinds of obvious reasons. We're asking the foxes to lock themselves out of the hen house. Foxes don't do that. And so the public is frustrated, but the elected officials are aloof and paying no attention to the public on this score. I don't know if public financing is the issue. I don't know if raising the limits are the issue. There are people who have devoted their lives to this issue. The question is, there needs to be leadership. I know it's a word we seldom think of, but it is an issue that someone must lead this country on this subject. We have a crisis of confidence in our government today for good reason, and someone must find a way to clean it up. And that consensus at this moment does not exist, except that something must be done. As Colin Powell said, fix the process. And I think that's where this issue is in this country today.
Do you foresee an investigation similar to Whitewater of the Dole's business deals with supporters if Dole wins the White House?
I try never to predict the future. There's no way of telling about future investigations. If the question is getting at the issue, are some of the personal dealings of Bob Dole intriguing? Yes, they are. Do most members of the United States Senate purchase condominiums, oceanfront condominiums, below the market price and make the first payment half a year after the purchase date? Most Americans don't do that. Are there questions over the years about some of these dealings? Yes. Does that mean there'll be an investigation in 1997? Absolutely not. Who knows? I mean, it doesn't guarantee anything. We all know how delicate and tricky things are about investigations, how subjective they are, and I'm not going to go down that road.
Are contributions to the American Red Cross, headed by Elizabeth Dole, another way to get access?
In the buying of the President, we have information about several spouses. We have information about Wendy Graham, Hillary Clinton, Honey, Alexander, and yes, Elizabeth Dole. This is a new issue of ethics in this town that is going to bear some additional thought and scrutiny, is what about spouses? What about their entanglements and their involvements in the two-income families that we now have that we maybe didn't have 20 or 30 years ago when ethics laws were drafted? There is a whole body of work and thought that probably has not occurred yet in dealing with this issue. Elizabeth Dole has indicated she will stay at the Red Cross, and she will try to run the Red Cross and raise millions of dollars in her job as president while she is the First Lady. She certainly has, under the Constitution, a right to work anywhere she wants. It's also unprecedented historically for a First Lady to have a job, full-time, demanding job like that, also interacting in terms of millions of dollars with potential donors also to the Republican Party. Is there a potential there for problems? I think it's obvious that there is some potential. That she has taken certain steps to avoid this. There are stories in the works that are going to come in weeks ahead. Her way of dealing with it is when she meets with people on behalf of the Red Cross, and they say, by the way, we're very excited about Senator Dole, and we'd like to talk to you about contributing. She'll ask the other Red Cross people to leave the room, and then she'll talk to them about Bob. I would suggest that she might want to think a little more elaborately about putting these walls up. That seems like a pretty thin wall to me. So I think there are potential problems and issues here.
Another consumer advocacy group, Common Cause, condemns the role of big money PACs but condones participation by labor unions. What is your opinion of union contributions to political campaigns, such as the '96 effort to target 40 House Republican freshmen?
If there's one thing that we tried to make clear in the buying of the President, it's money is money. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter if it's from corporations, it's from law firms, it's from trade associations, it's from wealthy individuals, or yes, it's from labor unions. Labor unions have made a decision some time ago that the way that they will compete with business is to try to match or exceed the spending that they do in House and Senate races and other federal offices. If you look at any of the numbers, the amount of money that's spent by labor, the actual number spent by labor, is approximately 1/3 what business spends. But have they tried to influence the process with money? If that's the question, absolutely they have tried to do it. They've given $7 or $8 million to the Democratic Party since 1992. They usually, of course, support Democrats. Now there's a big issue because they're going to spend $35 million to educate voters, or whatever the euphemism is about how they've described they're going to spend their money. But remember, it doesn't matter whether they spend $35 million or $15 million or $60 million. They're still going to be outspent by the people that they oppose every day, generally, which is business. The point is, you have an arms race of sorts with money. You have all these folks are giving as much as possible because they want to attain influence and access to power. And it really doesn't matter where they're coming from because that's their interest and they've got the bucks. The problem is the average American doesn't have any money. The average contribution to campaigns, most Americans, in fact, 96% of the American people do not contribute to campaigns at all. A check of $200 and larger comes from 1/3 of 1%, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. The point I'm making here is money is a very, very exclusive game. Most Americans don't have it, and they don't spend it on politics. So you have this game going on amongst these interests, and the public is on the sideline. And that's sort of what's happening here.
How much undisclosed money is there in the political process, and what should be done to bring soft money and other undisclosed sources of political funds to light?
There's a ton of undisclosed money. One of the things that business groups would say about my last response is, what about all the labor union members around the nation? 14 million people who, as volunteers, can get out the vote. Well, what about that get out the vote? What about the Christian Coalition? What about gun rights groups? What about anti-abortion rights? Those folks are spending millions of dollars in person hours, as well as phone banks, as well as actual expenditures. Some of the expenditures are required to be disclosed under the FEC, but some of that other stuff, there's no way of calculating the amount. Soft money is a huge problem. In 1907, there's a law in the books that says corporations cannot give money directly to candidates. So guess what they do, folks? They give it to the party, and it's laundered through the party. 70% of both parties' money today comes from corporations, including the Democratic Party. And the way what happens is tens of millions of dollars. Both parties have separately pledged that they're going to raise $120 million in soft money between now and November. These numbers are off the charts. This is unlimited money that's going to the parties that will be used for Bill Clinton and Bob Dole. This shows what a sham our laws have become since Watergate.
In your book, you say that candidates spend $1.47 billion in 1992 to run for federal offices. What's your estimate for '96?
I don't actually have an estimate. I mean, I think it will exceed $1.47 billion. I think, but it would be very speculative to give you a number. In 1988, the cost total, including matching funds for the presidential campaign by all candidates, was $500 million. In 1992, it was $550 million. The general thinking is that it will easily exceed $600 million this time. That's just the presidential, not counting the congressional races. Politics is getting more and more expensive every day, and a lot of people can't afford to get in this game. The average cost of a House seat now is $600,000. The average cost of a Senate seat is over $4 million unless you live in California, and then you've got really big problems.
3 story ideas, please, that reporters are not pursuing.
Well, the short answer is read our newsletter. It's coming out. I'm serious. We have, since we've added Bill Hogan and others at the center, we've got some magnificent projects that I think are revealing. I think there are many ideas for projects. One is where is the United States in this issue in relation to other nations? Some countries have very short election processes. They have no cost of advertising. It's all given by the public because the public owns the airwaves. There could be some very interesting comparative reporting with other nations. I think you should look really closely at this story that broke over the weekend about Bob Dole. I think that's very interesting to a lot of people. As Meredith O'Brien of the Center has written an editorial in the last day from our center. This is deja vu all over again. Bob Dole was in trouble in 1988. A company called Birdview raised $24,000. The employees were basically forced to, or told to give the money, and then they were reimbursed, which is a criminal violation. They ended up paying fines when the FEC finally got around to it 7 years later. And so today, we now have Bob Dole calling for the FEC to investigate this new allegation that a company in Boston, or in the Massachusetts area, employees have ponied up, including spouses, I don't know if children are involved, $40,000 from 40 people, the so-called bundling thing that happens frequently. This is something that you should always look carefully at. I urge all reporters to do something which I know will be really popular, and that is go read these records really closely.
The Los Angeles Times conducted expensive, groundbreaking investigations of how politicians spend their money, not just how they raise it. With cost cutbacks, the Times has drawn back from that sort of large effort. What is the result, and is anyone filling those large shoes?
Well, the person who did most of that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Dwight Morris and folks that work with him have actually created their own company called Campaign Study Group, and they're working independently with various news organizations to continue doing this expenditure research. You cannot begin to imagine how complicated it is to go through and look at expenditures. You have the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, and you have about a dozen other committees at the national level, building funds, you name it, they've got a committee for it. And then every state has their own party committees. And figuring out how that money filters into the party and out around the country is just an incredibly tortuous experience that really almost no one wants to go through, including Dwight Morris in the LA Times. I don't think anyone's ever done the ultimate in expenditure analysis. Who's picking it up? At the moment, other than Dwight, I don't know of anyone.
What does the national press need to understand to more effectively cover money in politics, and what mistakes should be avoided?
Well, as I was saying in some of my statement there, I think that too often there's two things that political reporters don't do: windows and investigative reporting about where the money came from. I think they need to start looking at what that money bought and who gave it, and those questions that are unseemly, that no one ever, it's like a hair in the soup, nobody wants to acknowledge it. I think it's time political reporters. I used to be a sports writer years ago, and you always want to be on the bus. You want to get to know the people you're covering, and that's the conundrum that political reporters have. If they ask them about the fat cat or the corporate angel that is the #1 patron, they probably won't be still riding on the bus, or at least they just won't be able to get close to that press secretary the way they could before. I think news organizations should have other reporters other than political reporters do this kind of reporting, and just understand and acknowledge that political reporters are too close to their people they're covering. I honestly think that would be a useful idea to try. And I think the other question, there was a second part of that, right?
Well,
what mistakes should be avoided? I think, in fairness, we do keep saying that money is not the only thing here, that I do think it's not a one-to-one correlation. People have to occasionally understand that money in politics is like when people play golf, it's the greens fee. You want to get on the course, you got to pay the money. It doesn't always mean that the company or the law firm or whomever got something in return. Believe it or not, occasionally they hope to get something in return next week. But you can't always show it, and reporters have got to understand this work is hard, it's tedious, it takes time, and you will occasionally not see what you are certain you will see.
You say in your book that President Clinton learned early in Arkansas that a politician had to appear highly concerned with bettering lives of ordinary citizens, but had to be careful not to act so aggressively on those concerns as to threaten interests of the business elite. You mentioned the connection between Goldman Sachs and the Mexico bailout. What are some other examples where those two strains are come into conflict?
It was really interesting to us about Clinton. In his first political race of his life, he ran as a Watergate reform candidate in 1974 for the House of Representatives. He raised $20,000 more than the four-term incumbent Republican congressman. Now, here's a 28-year-old Fayetteville, Arkansas assistant law professor. Where does he get that kind of money to best a 8-year veteran of Washington? Well, he got it from traditional sources, some Oxford pals from his Rhodes Scholarship days, as well as labor unions like teachers' unions and other groups. And teachers' unions, by the way, are his #2 all-time patron, the New York State Teachers Union. But he also became aligned immediately with the powers that be in Arkansas, namely Tyson's, among others. Tyson was in his district. And Clinton would not ever talk about Tyson's food openly. He would always refer to the plight of chicken farmers. It was always in code. But he felt their pain, these chicken farmers. And if you looked at what happened in 1980, he lost. What happened is he alienated some of the business interests. And we talked to some people around him, close friends of his to this day, and they said he had an incredible epiphany. He realized that he could utter populist bromides to the people, but he better not get in the way of business down in the state of Arkansas. This is not the only state where this is the case. But he understood throughout the 80s that there might not be tough enforcement of Tyson when it comes to polluting the streams and rivers. On and on and on, these relationships go on. One other I can't resist mentioning, it's not one of our top 10 career patrons, but we thought the relationship with Nations Bank was quite interesting. Here's a situation where a bank was anxious to expand. They had a bill they were pushing hard but were unsuccessful with, the interstate branch banking bill. They dumped $500,000 into Congress in '91 and '92. It wasn't working. They still couldn't get that because they didn't have the White House. So Hugh McColl, the chairman of Nations Bank, had a breakfast with Governor Clinton a month before the election, and he said, "Governor, I'll support you if you will help us on interstate branch banking." Clinton said, "Sure, no problem." Soon after, the money starts flowing from Hugh McColl personally to the Clinton campaign and the Transition Fund. Pretty soon, McColl and Clinton are pals, hanging out at the White House family quarters. They're going to the NCAA basketball games together. And Clinton pledges his regulatory reform for banking in 1994 is interstate branch banking. The bill is signed into law. By the way, Nations Bank estimated it would save the bank $50 million a year. It was signed into law in September 29th, 1994 in the aptly named cash room of the Treasury Department. Standing next to the President of the United States is Hugh McColl. And 3 weeks later, Nations Bank gives the Democratic Party a $3.5 million loan at a favorable interest rate. At a time the party was strapped for money, they were millions of dollars in debt. Now, the DNC, the White House, and Nations Bank all say that this is completely unrelated. And I can see why they'd say that.
You do make the link between Goldman Sachs and the Mexican bailout, as though Clinton bailed out Mexico to help Goldman Sachs. But wasn't there a larger diplomatic and national interest question, such as the Mexican economy possibly collapsing so that unemployed Mexicans would cross our border?
It's an excellent question. I said in my statement, whatever you think of the bailout, the public should know the relationship between the patrons and the politicians. They should know that Goldman Sachs is very tight with this particular president. They should know, if they read the book, that one of the key companies or banks in the country helping with the legal defense fund is Goldman Sachs in a very quiet way. There's no question perhaps the bailout was a good idea. I don't get into policies or testify for or against cabinet nominees or any of those kinds of things. That's a whole other issue. I know that there's a constituency and strong arguments diplomatically and economically why that might have been a good thing. But I think the public needs to know the relationship, and I honestly think Robert Rubin set himself up for controversy by handling the issue. There are others at Treasury that could have handled that bailout. By him personally handling it, he was liable in terms of civil litigation from Mexico. He personally was vulnerable to being sued by bondholders through Goldman Sachs down there. I mean, when you're that deeply enmeshed, your recusal from your prior employer should not be 1 year, as it is now. I think perhaps it should be a few more years, especially something that significant involving that much taxpayer money. I think he left himself open.
Lobbyists are feverishly trying to discover loopholes in the new congressional gift limits. Under the first beer loophole, staffers buy 1 beer at a bar, then lobbyists pick up the tab for the rest of the night. What are the most outrageous loophole scams you've discovered?
That's a pretty good one. There are many, many scams. We're still figuring out what's going to happen with this law. My favorite one, to tell you the honest truth, is the Senate Ethics Committee Chairman Mitch McConnell, who wants to lift the gift ban for the conventions for the 4 days in San Diego and Chicago. Mitch McConnell is deeply concerned that this will tax their administrative capabilities at the Ethics Committee. And obviously this is completely ludicrous. There is no more elaborate schmoozing that goes on. It is the Super Bowl of influence mongery, are the two conventions. If you don't enforce the gift ban then, you might as well just forget it. So there are a lot of jokes about this gift ban, but I think the American people are fed up, and they do think that these folks are feathering their own nest, or that the incestuousness has gotten a little too cozy. Exactly whether this is a perfect law, probably almost certainly it's not. I am pleased that we know more about, I'm less interested, believe it or not, in the gift ban than I am disclosure. For years, the only place you knew about in this town were foreign governments and foreign corporations through the Justice Department Foreign Agent Registration Act, which has its own problems. Half the foreign lobbyists don't register. That's another problem. But if you were a U.S. corporation, if I was investigating Mitsubishi and its contacts with the White House, it would be at the Justice Department. If I was investigating Metropolitan Life's contacts with the White House, it's a U.S. company, so there would be no records anywhere. Well, that's a serious problem. Now you have all lobbying, domestic and foreign, is registered in some capacity. It might not be perfect, but we will know more about lobbying than we used to. One last thing on that. We did a healthcare study looking at 660 healthcare groups trying to influence healthcare one way or another, which I could talk about for a few days, but I'll spare you. But 60 groups spent 49 groups spent $60 million trying to influence healthcare using the airwaves. The famous Harry and Louise ads were $15 million alone. There is not one piece of paper anywhere in Washington that lists how much they spent on TV ads. Grassroots lobbying and TV ads are not included in these new reforms. So we have a long way to go about disclosure, I think.
Larry Pratt vehemently denied having any ties to fascist groups. A handful of black and Jewish leaders came out to repudiate your characterization of him. Who was right, those who know him personally or your report? Actually, I'm sheepish to admit this, but most of what we reported about Larry Pratt had already been reported in different places, but no one had remembered it or could find it, I guess. We talked to Larry Pratt for a month before this story broke. We also talked to the press secretary, to Pat Buchanan. They knew that we were looking at Pratt's background. They knew that we thought these entanglements with these extreme groups was peculiar, to put it politely. You know, what Pratt wants to say, and he's gone around the country on the radio and everything else saying that he's been wronged, but he fails to mention that he admitted the first day he has news conference that he had been at these meetings. My only question was the following: why is someone who is tied to these groups and teaching hate groups how to develop militias, writing books and other things, which gets less publicity than the meetings? To me, that's more significant in some ways. Why is someone like that one of 4 co-chairmen of a national major presidential campaign? This thing came out when Buchanan almost beat Dole in Iowa and was leading in New Hampshire. To me, this was stunning and amazing, and I thought it bore mention. Whether or not Larry Pratt is a fine American and Larry Pratt can say all he wants. He has that right, and he has been saying it. Before I ask the last question, I would like to present a certificate of appreciation to you for your appearance today and a National Press Club mug.
Thank you. That's right.
And I'd like to ask, what do contributors to presidential campaigns get for their money? Now you've discussed this a bit, but this is a multiple choice. Number 1, access. Number 2, influence. Or number 3, good tickets to the inaugural ball.
Usually D, all of the above. They absolutely get A, access. They, depending how much they gave, they'll get B, influence. $1,000, even $5,000 just doesn't get what it used to. You know, the two parties issued these menus. If you give $100,000, you get to have dinner with the president. So if you only give $2,000 or $3,000, you're sort of down the pecking order there in terms of what you'll get back. You still might get to go to the ball, though.
And could you tell us your internet address?
Right. It is www.essential, ESSENTIAL.org/CPI.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our staff members, Melissa Bender and Chad Taylor and Melanie Abdu-Dermott and Howard Rothman for organizing today's luncheon. Good day and thank you.